Hey historians, Mr. Birch here. Today we're going to be going over the colonialism and revolution eras for STAAR test review, okay? So for 8th grade history STAAR test, I have compiled every single STAAR question that has ever been asked over these two periods. There's about 39 or 40 questions total. We're going to be going over every single one of those in the second half of today's lesson. The first half we're going to review the eras. And if you have it in front of you, great. If not, push pause and go grab your step-by-step survivor's guide. This guide that kind of looks like this. Should be about a 22, 23-page guide. Make sure you get that. Have that in front of you. Get a pen, marker, highlighter, whatever you need to be able to add some notes or change, alter, add, highlight, whatever you need to do as we go along, okay? And like I said, yeah, just make sure you have that with you. So pause if you need to go get it. If you got it, then let's do it. Today we're going to be going over that for the first half. Second half is going to be a lot of questions. So stick with us. If at some point going on, if I'm going too fast over the questions, because there's a lot, if I'm going too fast, push pause right after I read the question. Give yourself a chance to look over the possible answers and answer it yourself, and then push play when I go over it so that you've actually been able to engage your brain, answer the question yourself, and not just sit there and watch a video. Your ability to not only understand the facts of this era by going over the review with me and studying on your own, but also your ability to look at these questions and interpret what the answers are is going to be crucial for your success on this test. All right, let's get started. Okay, first page of the review. You should be looking at this along with me either on the video or on your review packet with you. 1492, Christopher Columbus, he's an explorer for the country of Spain. He lands in the Caribbean islands, opening up the New World to massive exploration from the Old World. We know the New World is the Americas, the Western Hemisphere. The New World is North America and South America. And the Old World is, in this case, Europe, but also refers to Asia and Africa. All right, so that was in 1492. We have not seen a single question specifically about Columbus on the test. You might see something about the Columbian Exchange. Okay, the Columbian Exchange is the transfer of ideas, products, foods, animals, lifestyle, religion, disease, any number of things that transitioned starting with Columbus and for hundreds of years, even to modern times after Columbus, just because these two worlds collided for the first time. The old and the new world, the Americas and the rest of the world. Because of that collision, a lot of the things that I just listed there begin to be transferred around the world. That's what we call the Columbian Exchange, okay? Also, along with that topic, it ended up leading to the most significant Columbian Exchange of our U.S. history studies, which is the triangular trade. And that was the exchange of slaves from Africa to the Americas and American goods and products or raw materials going to Europe. So the Europeans would go down to Africa, capture slaves, kidnap people essentially, and bring them to the Americas to be slaves on the southern plantations mostly. And then a lot of those raw materials would be grown, oftentimes by slaves, and then sent to Europe. That was the triangular trade. Okay, so from Columbus to 1607, that's 1492 to 1607. That's a long period of time. That's over 100 years. Well, there was a lot of conquistadors, and we've talked a lot about that. But we haven't seen anything about that on the STAAR, and I don't think you're going to see it. So let's move forward. The conquistadors come, many explorers come, a lot of people come and change the face of the Americas. So in 1607, Jamestown is settled in Virginia. It's the first permanent British settlement in the New World. They formed the first representative government in America called Virginia House of Burgesses. If you ever see anything about Virginia House of Burgesses, more than likely what we've noticed on the test is that it's going to be in regard to representative self-government, something like that. So that's in 1607. 1620, you got the Pilgrims. They land at Plymouth. They sign the Mayflower Compact. We know the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower ship. The Mayflower Compact is an early form of self-government. By the way, all of these early forms of self-government, the Mayflower Compact, the Virginia House of Burgesses, any number of these initial early colonial governments, what we've noticed on the test is these early colonial governments, they set the framework for American attitudes, and we're going to see that represented on questions on the test. So anything about early colonial governments, those are something you need to look for answers that say something like self-government or representative government, something that represents their form of government that later influenced our current government in our lives today. These early colonists mostly governed themselves and didn't like being told what to do from afar. Remember that. After the Virginians and the Pilgrims, thousands more arrived, settling in Massachusetts, Delaware, Rhode Island, North and South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Georgia, New York, Maryland, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and New Jersey. These were all British colonies subject to the king and the British Parliament. But they were never represented in the British Parliament. I think you guys know where I'm going with that. The colonies formed for 3 different reasons, basically, and we've seen all of these, or most of these, represented on the test too. So religious freedom for themselves, but not necessarily everyone else. Okay, so for religious freedom, for economic reasons, trying to gain land and personal wealth, like the Pilgrims, they settled for religious freedom from persecution about their religious beliefs in England. Well, economic reasons, that would be Jamestown. That would be the House of Burgesses, if you remember, from Jamestown. So economic reasons, they came for their own personal wealth. But overall, a lot of these British settlements, the big picture was the British expansion of their empire. There is a question about that. I've seen at least 1 or 2. The British expansion of their empire. They're just growing their empire, right? They're in England, now they're in the Americas, and they want to grow their empire across the world. Well, each colony was unique and had very different lifestyles. That makes sense. They're each a different colony, right? So they have their different beliefs, cultures, and even different types of self-government, though they were all British subjects. These colonists did not necessarily consider themselves Americans. They identified themselves as British and or by their colonial homeland. For example, I'm a Virginian, I'm a New Yorker. Okay, whatever colony they're from, well, that's how they identify themselves. But they're still British subjects, British citizens to a degree too. So the French were also exploring in North America. It's not just the British at this time. The French were mostly in the areas north of present-day United States, which was Canada. So in the northern parts of Americas, in Canada, and in the west, which at that time was west of the Appalachian Mountains in what we called the Ohio River Valley. Remember that. The Ohio River Valley is where the French were. Why were the French there? They were there for trade, trapping, hunting, and for pelts, which is just a fur that was sold in Europe. So the French were there for economic reasons. Well, in the French and the British, they were both kind of starting to push on each other for this land, specifically over the Ohio River Valley, where the French occupied, and the British wanted to move west into this land. So in 1754, the French and Indian War began, and it was actually between the British and the French. Don't get that confused. French and Indian War is between the British and the French over the American land. This is over the Ohio River Valley, the area in the Americas. The British eventually won this war and gained all of the land, but it cost them lots of money, as all wars do. You're going to see plenty of test questions that we go over in these other guides about after a war, the country even that won the war was in debt. And same is true with the British. So let's talk about the 3 different types of British colonies. You have the New England colonies. And here's just some bullet points about the New England colonies, where they were and what type of colonies they were. And we'll do the same for the Middle and Southern colonies. So the New England colonies, we need to know that they're in the far north. They have really good harbors. Cities like Boston Harbor, was a great harbor. These deep harbors, by the way, which allowed big ships to come really close to the land, which allowed them to, well, do shipping, lumber, and have a lot of business and merchants because these deep harbors, big ships could come in, they could load and unload goods. Also, New England was known for having a cold climate, so it really wasn't good for a lot of growing, but they had a lot of forests, so lumber, and then building ships because of that lumber. And then Boston eventually, and some other areas up here in the New England colonies, later on, during the Industrial Revolution, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we see the emergence of a lot of factories because New England has a lot of fast-flowing rivers and waterfalls, which could generate energy for the mills. So the country, or the colonies and eventually the states of New England were Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. All right, the middle colonies. These had small farmers, not that the farmers themselves were small, but they were small land farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. More religious toleration in the middle colonies. New York City, Philadelphia, and then in the very southern edge of the middle colonies was Chesapeake Bay. You have New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. So the southern colonies, they're more traditional, good farmland and climate, large plantations. Think cash crops, things like tobacco, cotton, sugar, rice, indigo. And then slavery was common in the South. Obviously, we know that as we get to the Civil War. So Virginia, Maryland, North and South Carolina, and Georgia were the southern colonies. After the British won the French and Indian War, again, remember the British versus the French, trying to gain the lands of the Ohio River Valley, King George made the Proclamation of 1763. That was immediately after winning the war. So they had won the Ohio River Valley, which is west of the Appalachian Mountains, west of the current British colonies. But this proclamation of 1763, and I have a map about it later, says that no British colonists could go west of the Appalachian Mountains. Even though they have the land, he doesn't want them to go there because he's trying to keep his colonists from attacking and being attacked by Indians. There's a lot more Indians out in west of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, the French and Indian War cost the British a lot of money, and they were deep in debt. I talked about that earlier. Therefore, they had a brilliant idea. Let's tax the colonists because they can pay back all the money that we lost fighting the French and Indian War. After all, we fought it for them, so why don't we get some money back for the French and Indian War that we won, but we lost a lot of money. So taxing these colonists, well, we can imagine, just like today, taxes don't go well for the people being taxed. They don't usually like it. So the British taxes on the colonists. These are the ones that we need to know. 1764, we know the war ended in 1763, so one short year later, there's the Sugar Act, which is a tax on sugar. 1765, the Stamp Act. Well, that's not a tax on stamps. That's a tax on all things that you would stamp. So things like paper products. All sorts of paper products, by the way. Anything that you would buy, pretty much, that would, from a newspaper to a pamphlet to a birth certificate to whatever it might be, registration for anything that's paper, it's going to be stamped. Even playing cards have a stamp on it, so you have to pay tax. Both of these, by the way, were repealed, which repealed just means that they were done away with in 1766. So that's just a couple years later. And why were they repealed? Why would the British, who are taxing the colonists, decide all of a sudden to stop taxing them? That's because the colonists were boycotting, which just means that they were refusing to purchase products that were taxed. Excuse me, they were boycotting, they were rebelling against, there was a lot of outcry against these things. Well, then after they repealed these, then the Parliament had what's called the Declaratory Act. They said, well, okay, we're not going to tax you, but we still have the right to tax you if we want to. Kind of a weak little statement there. Well, then they decided to use that right. 1767, just a couple years later, the Townshend Acts were taxes on everything practically. There were taxes on glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea. Well, those were all things that were manufactured in England, and then the colonists couldn't manufacture them themselves. They didn't have the facilities at this point, so they were having to buy them from England. So these were all purchased from them, and then they were taxed. Well, this did not go well, just like the other taxes. One thing to note here is that all these taxes began to unite the once very separate and individual unique colonies, as they all were taxed equally, or as they all began to receive oppression from the British government against their finances. These different colonists began to unite. One of these united groups was called the Sons of Liberty, and they actually increased communication between the colonists and began to kind of rile the colonists up against this British oppression. The chant began, "No taxation without representation." We don't want to be taxed unless we're going to have somebody representing us in the British Parliament. They were used to having their own representative government, and now British Parliament, who was not representing them, just taxing them. That didn't seem fair. So in 1770, 3 years after the Townshend Acts, well, these citizens in Boston, they were probably, that's where Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty were stationed. Well, they were not taking these taxes lying down. They did not like it. So the British troops at the Boston Massacre, it was Boston citizens getting riled up, going to the streets, possibly doing all kinds of terrible things. Maybe a drunken crowd is what you might picture. Well, they were pressing against the British troops. Eventually, the British fired 5 citizens. 5 Bostonians were killed. News of this, that's what we call the Boston Massacre. News of this spread throughout the colonies quickly thanks to men like Paul Revere, and it united these colonists even more against the British. Something like a massacre will do that. So 3 years later, we have the Tax Act in 1773. This is a tax on tea. Well, this led to the 1774 Boston Tea Party. Makes sense, right? The Tea Act comes out, a tax on tea. We know that the Tea Party is when the Sons of Liberty, which is the group led by Sam Adams, the ones who were standing against the British taxes and British oppression, and to know they didn't want taxes without representation. Well, these Sons of Liberty stormed onto some ships in the Boston Harbor, and they dumped all of this tea in the ocean as a protest of the tax on tea. And we as Texans, we know we love our sweet tea. It'd be kind of like us dumping sweet tea in the ocean and saying we'll never drink sweet tea again. So think how big a deal that was for them. They liked their tea. They dumped the tea into the ocean. And as you can imagine, the British government, the king and parliament were outraged. How dare you do this? So 1774, the same year of the Boston Tea Party, but because of the Boston Tea Party, well, the British imposed what they called the Coercive Acts. Coercive just means I'm going to force you to do something. Well, these acts became known by the colonists as the Intolerable Acts. Intolerable means, well, I can't tolerate it. I will not stand it. I hate it. It's intolerable. It's not okay. So they called them the Intolerable Acts. What were these Intolerable Acts? Well, they limited the rights of the citizens of the colonies, specifically Massachusetts, which is where Boston's located, in New England. Well, it also allowed for more quartering of troops, and it removed the charters. It removed the rights of the governments of some of the colonies, or specifically Massachusetts. And it also changed the way that they were judged for their crimes. Now the British were judging them. They were sending many of the colonists all the way over to England if they thought they committed a crime. So they weren't judged by their peers. They were judged by men all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. So in that same year, 1774, these tensions rose as the British troop presence increased. They brought more British troops into the city of Boston. Taxes were being pushed on the citizens. The Boston Massacre, you have the colonial boycotts, the Tea Party. Representatives from across the colonies, all across the colonies, finally met for the first time ever. Okay, this is what we call the First Continental Congress. And they met because the whole continent met together, the whole, at least what we currently call the United States, that whole colonists of the first 13 colonies. They met and discussed a unified course of action. As I said earlier, all these taxes and oppression made them want to join together against a common enemy. At this point, the enemy being the British, who were taxing them unfairly. Well, they encouraged this First Continental Congress. The main thing that we need to know, First Continental Congress formed and was the first unified vision for the colonies. But the main thing that they do is they encourage the formation of militia groups. They encouraged militia groups to form throughout the colonies, which are just localized groups of, think about it, militia, military. They're military groups in each colony who were forming to possibly withstand or to fight against the British regulars, the British troops, if need be or if the case arose, right? Well, it did arise very shortly after this in 1775. Thomas Gage was a British general, and he led British troops from Boston. As I said, Boston was filled with British troops now. He led these British troops from Boston to recover a stash of weapons at the nearby town of Concord, Massachusetts, right near Boston, Massachusetts. Well, I already mentioned him earlier, the colonist Paul Revere. He rode ahead. We know this is Paul Revere's midnight ride. He rode ahead on horseback, warning the citizens of Concord and Lexington along the way throughout the night as the British troops were marching through the night, trying to be kind of sneaky through the night, marching there, hopefully getting there at first dawn or whatever, and doing this without a resistance. Well, Paul Revere had warned them. So at Lexington, as the British troops were marching towards Concord, on their way they stopped in Lexington. Lexington, well, these men had already been warned, so the militia formed, and this is what we call the start of the Revolutionary War. It's often called the shot heard round the world, the very first shots fired of the Revolutionary War, as the militia group in Lexington fired upon the British troops. And in fact, we don't actually have record to know who fired the first shot, but it was the colonists fighting against the British. Very short-lived. Some colonists died. The British troops moved on. They got to Concord. By the time they got there, the storehouse of all the weapons had mostly vanished, and there was very little for them to get. So as they marched back to Boston, the colonists were picking them off, shooting them from roadside as they went back, killing almost 200 of the British troops. This was the start of the Revolutionary War, so you might want to remember that. Lexington, start of the Revolutionary War. 1775, British troops win the hard-fought Battle of Bunker Hill and take over Boston. So the Battle of Bunker Hill was technically won by the British, but it was a very terrible win, if there is such a thing. They lost many troops, and the American colonists proved that they were up to the challenge of fighting against the more seasoned and noteworthy British troops, okay? So again, Lexington, first battle, Battle of Bunker Hill, well, that was in the taking of Boston by the British troops. So in 1775, same year, Second Continental Congress meets. If you ever see the difference between First and Second Continental Congress, 9 times out of 10, the Second Continental Congress is the one that you're going to need to know, because it's the significant one that started the formation of our country. Well, they began governing the colonies, okay? So this is the first time we had a government ruling over the different colonies. These different men were representing the different colonies at the Second Continental Congress, and they appointed George Washington to be the commander of the newly formed Continental Army. It was the colonists' Union Army, United Army, against the British troops. July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress, this Second Continental Congress, by the way, but the Continental Congress declares their independence. Well, we know what that is. That's the Declaration of Independence. That's them telling King George, telling the British government, telling Parliament, and telling everyone in the world, we are now the United Colonies. We are the United States, and we are declaring our independence. We are no longer dependent upon you. We are now going to be a free country, and you know that didn't come freely. And that's written by Thomas Jefferson. Don't forget that. We see that on the test. 1776, they've declared independence. The war already started pretty much in Lexington. They've had some battles already. We declared our independence July 4th, 1776. Well, 1776, there's a Battle of Trenton. Washington's troops cross the Delaware River, and they defeat the British on Christmas. I'm not going to go into great detail of these. These are just a couple of the major high points that we see of the Revolution occasionally on the test. 1777, this one is on the test for sure, Saratoga. That is the battle where the Americans, led by General Gates, defeat the British. And this is the point that you really need to remember. The thing about the Saratoga that we see on the test. It is the turning point of the war, causing the French to want to help us in the fight. So Saratoga, that's the turning point, American victory. Doesn't mean that we win the war at that point, but it's a turning point that leads to the French wanting to help us and join in on the fight against the British. 1778, Valley Forge is not a battle. It is just where Washington's troops spend the winter barely surviving the freezing cold temperatures. Okay, that's Valley Forge. 1781, this one is very much worth noting. It's Yorktown. Yorktown is where American and French troops defeat the British forces in the final major victory of the war. General Cornwallis, leader of thousands of British troops, surrenders to Washington and the colonists, the Continental Army, and the French. So the British surrender to us at Yorktown, and that's pretty much the culminating final major victory of the war. So Yorktown, think of it, starts with a Y. It's kind of at the end of the alphabet, last battle. And then a couple years later, 1783, we finally, through some people meeting, representing the United States in Paris, France, it's the Treaty of Paris. British end fighting and give full independence to the United States. That's when our country becomes officially internationally recognized. Treaty of Paris, 1783. That's ending the war. Okay, talking a little bit about U.S. government. I'm going to speed through this a little bit more because we have a lot to cover. So first governments in the colonies were Virginia House of Burgesses, Mayflower Compact, Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, etc. All of these initial early colonial governments, they are things that you want to see on the test, something that talks about representative self-government, okay? Well, another thing, you have the First and Second Continental Congress, which I already talked about, where this was the first times these very different colonies joined together to agree in a unifying governing body. That's the First Continental Congress. And then the second one, we just got through talking about, they declared independence in the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. Religious freedom in the U.S. government. So it was sought by many of the early colonists, as I said earlier. Most were okay as long as they're shared, is the other people in their colony shared their beliefs. Think about the Pilgrims and the Puritans. You had to share their beliefs and act accordingly. That's what we would call religious freedom. It wasn't so much freedom for everyone. Though there were some, like Maryland, for example. Maryland was a colony where, and you might want to make a note of this, put Maryland out there beside that on your form. Maryland is a colony that allowed Catholics and... So let me give you just a second to write that. So Maryland was a colony that allowed Catholics and Protestants. Okay, so there was a little bit more toleration. Pennsylvania was another colony that had a little bit more toleration as well. All right, and then the Constitutional Convention. Oh, before we get to that, let's go 1777 on the left side there. So 1776, we declare our independence. Now we have to kind of form a government. We're independent, but we have to be a government. That's the Articles of Confederation. Think of it. It starts with the A. That's the first thing in the alphabet. It's the first government we have. Articles of Confederation. Well, it was the first backbone for the U.S. government. This is what you need to know about the Articles of Confederation. It did not give much power to the central federal government. It gave most of the power to the states. Well, that's because they were afraid of giving too much power to one main government. Think about King George or the British Parliament. They didn't want to give too much power away. Each state wanted some power. The problem was there was no president in the Articles of Confederation, our first government. There was no, and that's the executive branch, there was no federal judicial system, no Supreme Court. And so the central government didn't have much power. And well, the problem with that was that it was difficult for us to have a good government that could perform taxes and military things and international anything. It wasn't a strong government at all. Well, then just about 10 years later, we have the Constitutional Convention. That's when we restructure our government. And we formed the U.S. Constitution. So Constitution was what we still have today. It was passed in 1787. It's how the U.S. government functions even today. Here's the thing you need to know. It split the government into three branches. Presidential, which is executive branch. We have the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. And then you have the legislative branch, which is the Congress, right? House of Representatives and Senate. Well, there was a big argument at the Constitutional Convention between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. Anti-Federalist names who you might want to remember, Patrick Henry and George Mason. We've seen them both on the test. Well, they argued for more state and personal rights and freedom. And, well, eventually they pushed for, and it eventually did happen, the gaining of the Bill of Rights, which is our first 10 amendments. It gave a lot of rights explicitly stated now in these amendments to the Constitution to U.S. citizens. It gave us the right, freedom of speech, and all the things that come with, like the First Amendment are the ones that we probably know most famously. George Washington was chosen as the first president in the Constitutional Convention also. Well, the Northwest Ordinance, we see that too. It's established as a standard for how new states would be inducted into the Union. For some reason, we say that on every test, so know what the Northwest Ordinance is. It's about gaining new states into the Union in an organized fashion. All right, so we're almost to the end, so here's a quick timeline. I'm going to go through this rather quickly. If you need to press pause and think about it for a moment or make notes, go right ahead. Columbus, 1492, quote-unquote, discovers America, right? Opening up the New World to exploration and conquest. 100 years later, Jamestown is the first British settlement. Think about House of Burgesses, Jamestown, Virginia. It's a cash crop colony. They grow tobacco and they become very wealthy because of it. It's in the South. So 1620, Pilgrims land at Plymouth. Think Mayflower Compact, early representative government again, religious freedom. That's in Massachusetts. And then we have this big stretch of time here where a lot of the other colonies are formed. Along the eastern coast of North America, most are British and eventually make it up the original 13 colonies of the U.S. Well, 1754, the French and Indian War begins up to 1763. So almost 10 years long, the British and the French are fighting over the Ohio River Valley. The British eventually win, but the British are now in deep debt. Well, as a result of that debt, well, we'll get to it in a second. So the King of England has the proclamation of 1763 saying to the colonists, you cannot go past the Appalachian Mountains. Don't want you to go west of here. I don't want you fighting with Indians and Indians fighting with you and me having to send more troops and cost more money to protect you. Well, because of the war debt, because of the French and Indian War debt, the Sugar Act, the first of many taxes, is passed on these colonists. They're not represented, they're just taxed. And they said later, we don't want to be taxed without representation. Well, the Sugar Act, it altered a tax on sugar, actually, and won't go into all the details, but it was intended to raise money to help the British pay off the war debt. 1765, just a year later, Stamp Act is passed on almost all printed materials, again intended to pay back British war debt. And then you've got this, and I said those repealed, and then you have the Stamp Act. Due to colonial boycotts and protests, the tax ended, okay? Just like the rest of these tax ended, but the Stamp Act ends in 1763, just like the Sugar Act. So the Townshend Acts, that is in 1767. That's new taxes on glass, paper, lead, tea, all items colonists needed as British imports because they couldn't produce them themselves. So this was not good. It increased the taxes for the colonists significantly, and they were very frustrated by it. In their frustration, they were marching around Boston, and the Boston Massacre happened. 5 colonists shot dead by British troops as they protested the occupation of the British and the taxes. So news spread around the colonies of this Boston Massacre, and then we have the tea tax, and I didn't put that in here, but the tea tax comes out after that, and then you have the Boston Tea Party, right? Well, the Boston and the tea tax, I'm not going to go into the details of it. It altered the tax on tea, but there's a tea tax that comes after the Boston Massacre, and then in 1773, you have the Boston Tea Party. Colonial Sons of Liberty, led by Sam Adams, tossed the tea into the harbor in rebellion against this tax. Well, the Intolerable Acts come immediately after this because the British are upset about the Boston Tea Party and the boycotts and the riots that are happening across the colonies. These Intolerable Acts are originally called the Coercive Acts. You remember I said that means they're trying to force something to happen. Intolerable means we can't tolerate it, it's not good, we don't want to take it anymore. This limited the power of colonial government, reduced personal rights of the colonists, allowed quartering of British troops, punished colonists for rebellion. It was very intolerable, okay? Well, same year, the First Continental Congress meets. All of the colonies, representatives from each of them get together, and they decide, you know what, we need to start uniting to fight this British oppression. Well, right around that same time, the battles of Lexington and Concord take place when the British troops are marching from Boston trying to get to Concord to take weapons from these militia groups. And the battle starts in Lexington on their way to Concord, and this is the first shot heard around the world that starts the revolution. 1776, this Second Continental Congress meets, and they agree on Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And they say, yep, we're going to declare to the world we're independent from British rule. Well, as the battle is raging on, the Battle of Trenton, that's on Christmas night. Washington's troops capture 900 British in an early American victory. They sneak across on Christmas night. Pretty scheming move by Mr. Washington. Very cunning. And anyway, early American victory. 1776, you've got the Battle of Saratoga. Or 1777, Battle of Saratoga. It's the major American victory, which was a real turning point in the war because it convinced the French to say, wow, if they can win this battle, the Battle of Saratoga, we feel like it's going to be worth it for us to join and help the Americans beat the British. Then we form our first government. So we declared our independence, now we got to form a government to independently rule ourselves, right? The first American government is the Articles of Confederation. It was a weak central government. There was no executive branch. But, it kind of held us together for a little while there. 1781, the Battle of Yorktown, and that's the war. Remember I said Y for, it's like at the end of the alphabet practically. It's practically the end of the war. Battle of Yorktown, it's the war-ending battle victory by the Americans and French over the British troops. And then a couple years later, Treaty of Paris in 1783, the British finally say, okay, it's over. We concede defeat. You win. You can take all the American land. It's yours. You're an independent country. All right, so now let's look at a map here just to get your mind's eye wrapping around what's going on and what everything looks like. You see there in the pink on the far right, those are the colonies. Eventually, they grew and became the states. But those are the first 13 colonies in pink. You see my neon green little section there. That's the Appalachian Mountains. Remember I said if you see in the blue where it says Proclamation Line of 1763, that's the line after the French and Indian War, where the King George, or it wasn't, where the King of England says, you cannot go past this line. Don't go past here. Well, why is that line there? Because that's where the Indians were and they didn't want any more fighting. Well, the Ohio River Valley, the area in blue, that's the area that they fought over in the French and Indian War. Later on, this is not what we talked about today necessarily, but if you look at this map, it could be helpful. Down here in Georgia and Florida, and even up further than that, but up into Alabama up there as well. But this area is where you have the Indian Removal Act and eventually the Trail of Tears much later on, many years later, where the Indians are forced off of their land and then up to Oklahoma Territory. They're forced off their land, by the way, because of natural resources discovered in places like Georgia, and because the whites wanted those natural resources and they wanted the good agriculture, natural resources like gold, by the way, and that's what forced them off. Not so much on this particular study guide, but overall for the STAAR test, good to know. So here's some U.S. land acquisitions. Not all of these are in this study guide that we're talking about, but we'll go over them quickly. The Northwest Ordinance, you see at the top in the white on top of the map, it says Northwest Ordinance. That set the standard for how our government would input new states into the Union. Then let's look at the kind of brownish gold on the far right. It says original 13 colonies and the nearby territory in the Ohio River Valley that were acquired from England at the end of the Revolutionary War. We got all of the Ohio River Valley and all the original colonies. That was all American land after the Treaty of Paris in 1783 at the end of the Revolutionary War. Well, and then not long after that, you see in the white on the map and then the white below it, the white on the map, that's the Louisiana Purchase. It was the largest land grab in U.S. history, and it was by President Thomas Jefferson, the third U.S. president. He purchased this land from France in 1803 for $15 million. Then you have Texas, which became its own independent country in 1836 to about 1845, when in 1845 it actually joined the Union and became part of the United States. And that ended up sparking the Mexican War, which you see the pink area on the southwest of the United States is Mexican cession. After the end of the Mexican War, the U.S. defeated Mexico and gained all of this land from Mexico, everything in pink there. That's modern-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and even parts of Wyoming. That's Mexican cession. We gained all of that land. And then shortly after that, you have the Gadsden Purchase, which is that itty-bitty orange area. It's not that small in real life. It's pretty big, actually. But that was the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. After America gained all of the land of the Mexican cession, we said, let's get a little bit more. Then you have up in the northwest, the far northwest. That's not the Northwest Ordinance, by the way. That's something else. But in the far northwestern part of this map, you see the kind of yellowish color. That's the Oregon Territory. It used to be owned by Great Britain or claimed by Great Britain. We ended up agreeing with them to sign that little dotted line up there, and that became the Oregon Territory. All right, guys, I know that was a lot. You might want to push pause, take a little break, regenerate yourself, stand up, do some jumping jacks, and then let's get started. We're going to go over these questions. We're going to move quickly, okay? So if you need to push pause to look at the question yourself before I hit the answer, go right ahead. All right, you're back. You took a long break, I know. You're ready to do this. Okay, Intolerable Acts imposed. First Continental Congress convened. Thomas Paine's Common Sense published. All the events listed above occurred during the Revolutionary Era. Yeah, Intolerable Acts, First Continental Congress, everything we just talked about. This is the Revolutionary Era. How did geography influence the early economic development of New York, Boston, and Charleston? Well, natural harbors provided access to markets. Remember, I told you specifically in New England, cities like Boston and New York had very deep natural harbors. Maybe even if we don't know anything about Charleston, which is in the South, by the way, maybe we didn't know that, but if we at least know that Boston has good harbors, okay, and allowed these specific cities to have good shipping and able to bring supplies in and out from market. British colonists objected to the proclamation of 1763 because they resented the limits it imposed on westward expansion. You remember I say the proclamation of 1763 is after the French and Indian War. The British government said, hey, American colonists, you cannot go beyond this line. I proclaim it in 1763. You can't go past this line. You can't go west of here. Remember the map? That's at the Appalachian Mountains. Don't go west of that. They resented that because it didn't allow them to expand westward. Puritans founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony to escape persecution. Roger Williams was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony and formed a new colony that did not have a state church. Anne Hutchinson was expelled from the Massachusetts Bay Colony for dissenting against church doctrine. This diagram describes events in colonial America that are related to the establishment of the principle of religious freedom. So these are early colonial governments and colonial attitudes towards religion. And remember I told you that one thing we notice on the test is that there's kind of this idea towards religious freedom. And so we see that these are two examples of it. Roger Williams was banished because of his religious beliefs, and then he set up a little bit more religious tolerant society. Anne Hutchinson kind of had a similar experience here. Catholics immigrated to Maryland colony in the 17th century, primarily to escape persecution. Remember I told you before that the Maryland was a little bit more tolerant. They allowed Catholics and Protestants, and Catholics who were being persecuted by the Protestant church, they had kind of an area of refuge there in Maryland. Again, at any point, if you need to push pause or make a note on your study guide, do that. Don't just sit here and blankly watch the whole video. Make sure that you are taking something away from it, okay? We reposing special trust and confidence in your patriotism, valor, conduct, and fidelity do by these presents constitute and appoint you to be General and Commander-in-Chief of the of the Army of the United Colonies, and of all the forces now raised or to be raised by them, and all others shall voluntarily offer their service. Commission from the Continental Congress, June 17th, 1775. The Continental Congress issued this commission to whom? Yeah, that's George Washington, the commander of the Continental Army, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Declaration of Independence, 1776. This excerpt refers to rights that people refers to rights that people have as a result of being human. And I know you're thinking, what? Wait, huh? Well, think about this. This says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. They're obvious. They're evident in and of themselves without us having to do anything. They're obvious. They're self-obvious. All men are created equal. So you're born equal. So just by being human, you should have these rights. That's the point that it's talking about. 1787, Congress awarded John Paul Jones the Congressional Gold Medal in honor of his valor and brilliant services during the Revolutionary War, which accomplishment was Congress recognizing. There's a reason you don't have John Paul Jones on your study guide, because I'm going to bet my teaching certificate that they're not going to ask another question about him. Maybe I shouldn't bet that. You never know. Well, just so you can't say I didn't show it to you, John Paul Jones, he was commanding some U.S. troops, and they won a victory at sea against the British Navy. Which statement best explains the significance of the Mayflower Compact? It established a form of self-government based on social contract. So again, social contract is an agreement between the people being represented and the government that's representing them. But even if you couldn't remember that, you do know the whole self-government thing, right? Mayflower Compact was one of the very first American colonial governments, and it was a self-government or a representative government, right? For the well-governing of this province and territories there shall be an assembly, yearly chosen by the free men thereof to constitute or to consist of 4 persons out of each county. William Penn, Pennsylvania Charters of Privileges, 1701. Which feature of colonial government does this charter establish? All right, here we go. An elected legislature. You see separation of powers, checks and balances, and direct democracy, and you're thinking, oh, these all sound like really good American government words. Which one is it? Well, think about this. It says that for the well-governing, and I know the spelling's a little different because it's an older form of our language, but for well-governing of this province and the territories in it, there shall be an assembly chosen by the freemen. Right there, assembly chosen by people. That's, well, we elect these people to this assembly, this legislative body. We elect them. We choose them. Elected legislator. All right, distance from Great Britain, need for lawmaking structure, traditional rights of Englishmen, American colonists, question mark. Which of the following best represents the question mark on the diagram above? Okay, guys, here it is again. Same word. Kind of always looking for this. They established their own representative institutions. These representative self-governments. They were going to represent themselves and govern themselves because they're so far from Great Britain, and they need to have their own lawmaking structures here, and they wanted traditional rights. They wanted these rights. Well, they wanted to be represented. If they weren't represented in Parliament, So they wanted to be represented here. They established their own self-representing governments. Remember that. You're going to see it on the test. It is essential to the freedom and security of a free people that no taxes be imposed upon them but by their own consent or their representatives. The Sons of Liberty, addressed to the public, New York, December 15th, 1773. The excerpt above reflects the dissatisfaction of American colonists with the Okay, here we go. This excerpt above reflects the dissatisfaction of American colonists with the economic policies imposed by Great Britain following the French and Indian War. Okay, I know this doesn't explicitly say it, but what were the economic policies after the French and Indian War? Yeah, the British were in debt because of the war, and so now their policy was, we're in debt, we need money, we're going to tax the colonists, right? Up here in the statement, it says it. Now the Sons of Liberty, remember the colonial guys in Boston and throughout the colonies, they were saying, look, it's essential to our freedom and security that no taxes be imposed upon us without representation. All right. America may boast that she has accomplished what no power before her ever did, contending with Britain, captured 2 of their celebrated generals, and each an American of thousands of veteran troops to support them. Abigail Adams' letter to John Adams, December 9, 1781. To which of the following is Abigail referring in this excerpt? Okay. Yeah, she's talking about a great victory, celebrating American capturing and defeating British troops. That's the American victory at Yorktown, the final conclusive major victory of the war, where we captured thousands of British troops. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Declaration of Independence, 1776. Which provision of the U.S. Constitution reflects this grievance? The President can appoint justices with the advice and consent of the Senate. Congress has the power to establish federal courts. The Commerce Clause allows Congress to regulate trade among the states. Congress can override presidential veto with a 2/3 majority vote in both houses. Okay, let's break this one down a little bit. So it's saying which provision in the later formed U.S. Constitution reflects this grievance, reflects this problem that's declared here in the Declaration of Independence. It's talking about the King of England. He's saying he has refused his assent to laws. He's refused to obey the laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. These laws are good and wholesome for all of us, and he's refused to adhere to his own laws. And so this is saying here, which provision of the U.S. Constitution reflects this problem? Well, when we set up the U.S. Constitution, we made it so that the president can veto, which means basically say, heck no, I don't like it, it's not going to become a law, to any law that the legislators bring to his office to sign. He says, nope, I don't like it, even if you voted on it, I'm going to veto it, nope, it's gone, I don't like it. Well, we made this rule, or this law in the U.S. Constitution that says, okay, if the president vetoes it, like the king, and the king says, no, I don't like that law, forget it. Well, that in our government, in the Constitution, that law goes back to the House and the Senate, our 2 legislative branches, and they can, if they vote that law into action by 2/3 majority vote in both the House and the Senate, now it doesn't even matter if the president vetoes it or not, it still will pass. Unalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. The rights listed above were Okay? The rights listed above were defined by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. We find these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the Declaration of Independence. He was declaring that we are going to be independent from Great Britain, and why we are declaring our independence, and why we need to be independent, and why we have these rights. Okay, from 1690 to 1760, Parliament and the King of England allowed colonists in America to exercise a great deal of control over local and regional matters. Historians have described this practice as salutary neglect. Which of the following happened as a direct result of this policy? All right, so let's do this. Maybe you don't know what salutary neglect is. Okay. What we want to do is look at what the statement's talking about. Well, these colonies developed a strong tradition of self-government. So let's look at it. Maybe we don't get freaked out by one word or one phrase you don't know. It says from 1690 to 1760, Parliament and the King of England allowed the colonists in America to exercise a great deal of control over their local and regional matters. They had control over their own things, their own self-control, their own control over self. Self-government, right? We know that. We just have to not get worried when we see something we don't necessarily know. In 1636, Thomas Hooker established the first English settlement in Connecticut. Convinced that government should rest on free consent, he blank. Which of the following completes the sentence above? All right, here we go. Free consent. That you should be able to choose and freely participate in things. So he extended voting rights beyond church members. You should be able to participate regardless of your activity or lack of activity in the church. Again, another religious freedom point here. Which of the following was the primary reason France sought to colonize North America? Why did France colonize North America? We remember this one. The French were trying to trade furs and other goods. Remember, they were selling and buying beaver pelts and trading them with the Indians. That's what the French were doing. Characteristics of American colonies. So you have 4 columns, and then underneath these we have the northern, the middle, and the southern. So the northern, their resource was deep harbors, their climate was cold, and then you have a number 1 under their product. In the middle, they had rich farmland was their resource, a number 2 under climate, and under their products, the middle colonies had livestock. And then the southern colonies, you have a 3 under resource, and under climate it says warm climate in the southern colonies, then a 4 under their product. Which characteristic is correctly matched with a number in the table? All right, here we go. This one you may have had to press pause on just to kind of figure it out and look through it all. But if you see number 2 for a middle colony, the middle colonies had a middle climate, a moderate climate. That one makes sense. All the rest of them we can eliminate because all the rest of them are wrong. No, that seemed kind of obvious saying all the rest of them are wrong. But by the way, on these, I really want to encourage you guys to try to find a couple, and while we're doing it quickly like this, you have to press pause in order to do it, but try to find at least one or two that you know you can eliminate, and now you're left to just choose between 3, possibly even just 2, to find your right answer, okay? It's a good practice to have. So Sugar Act, Quartering Act, Stamp Act, these acts contributed to the start of the Revolutionary War by angering colonists who believed that their civil liberties had been violated. They shouldn't be taxed without representation, right? 2 of these things are taxes, and the Quartering Act meant that they would allow the British troops to live in the colonists' homes as long as they needed. That's kind of my civil liberty. It's taken away my freedom and liberty because I have to move out of my bedroom because the British troops are sleeping in there now. And I have to feed them and clothe them and wash their clothes and food, make their food and everything. That's not quite liberty and freedom. Colonial transatlantic trade. You have the European colonies with an arrow pointing to West African coast, arrow pointing up to colonies in America, then an arrow pointing back to European countries. Which factor most encouraged the growth of this trade? The profitability of cash crop agriculture. We know that as they begin to make more money off of cash crops like cotton in the South, that it became more profitable for them to get more slaves, which was what the colonial transatlantic slave trade was all about, right? West African coast, that's where they were stealing and kidnapping people to become slaves. Distance from Great Britain, Mayflower Compact, town hall meetings. The factors listed above contributed most to the okay. C. The factors listed above most contributed to the growth of representative government in the British colonies. Do you feel like you're hearing a repetitive theme here? The representative or self-government, things like the Mayflower Compact and how far they were from Great Britain, these town hall meetings, all these things that were churning up this early colonial government, representative self-government. Which statement accurately describes the reasons for establishing Plymouth and Jamestown? Okay. Plymouth was founded as a refuge from religious persecution, while Jamestown was founded for commercial profit. Remember, we already talked about that. Plymouth up north in Massachusetts was founded for religious freedom for a small sect of people against particular persecution, while Jamestown was commercial profit. Remember, Jamestown, they were looking for gold. They ended up planting tobacco, and that's how they made their money. Commercial profit. Profit for company. June, the Continental Congress appoints a committee to prepare a document. The committee selects Thomas Jefferson to compose a draft. The draft is reviewed and revised by the committee. And then in July, Congress debates and revises the document. Congress officially approves the document. This sequence of events resulted in the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Remember, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. It was signed into action July 4th, 1776. This all makes too much sense. Parliament passes the Tea Act of 1773. Colonists dump tea into Boston Harbor. Arrow pointing to a question mark. Which of these completes this graphic organizer? All right. King passes the Intolerable Acts. Remember, the Intolerable Acts were all those were originally called the coercive acts. They're intolerable because they're unfair to the colonists, and it's a way to punish them for the Boston Tea Party thing. Here in the autumn of 1777, American forces met, defeated, and forced a major British army to surrender. This crucial American victory in the Battle of blank renewed patriots' hope for independence, secured essential foreign recognition and support, and forever changed the face of the world. Which of the following best completes this excerpt? Okay, so we talked about different American battles. We've actually talked about all 4 of these here. So we have to figure out which crucial American victory. All 4 of those listed below. Only Concord really wasn't much of a battle, right? Remember, they just came to get the storehouse of American weapons, and there wasn't much, and they marched back, and the Americans shot at them some. Well, Saratoga, Trenton, and Yorktown were battles. Yorktown was the finishing one, but this says, this crucial American victory of the Battle of blank renewed patriots' hope for independence. So I would think that doesn't necessarily mean that the war is over yet, just that, well, we have hope now. But here's the part that really matters that I've told you about plenty already. It secured essential foreign recognition and support. We had the foreign recognition and support, remember, which was the French. The French decided to help us after this key turning point battle, which was Saratoga. The French decided to join and help us after this. Boston and New Orleans were both founded as we may not know about New Orleans. Hope you do, but we may not. We definitely know about Boston. It's a port city. It has a big harbor. Port is just means where a ship can come in, and it can port. It's a port city if it has areas, big harbors and bays where ships can come in. Which excerpt from the Declaration of Independence best explains why colonists were unhappy about their lack of representation in the British Parliament? All right. Remember, no taxation without representation. Representation, that means consent. Like if you consent to allow me to continue giving you these questions, that means you're allowing it. You're saying it's okay. So they're saying that he imposed taxes on us without us allowing it. We weren't even represented. The Puritans established communities in colonial New England. The Puritans held town meetings to deal with community issues. And then question mark. Which sentence best completes this diagram? All right. Whoa, big surprise. Representative self-government. Doesn't mean that's the clear-cut always answer, but a lot of times it is. It just means that if we look here, look what's happening. They're representing themselves. They're meeting together. It's a representative self-government. Characteristics of California and Florida: good climates for agriculture, long coastlines and natural harbors and bays, originally inhabited by American Indians. Which of these characteristics also describes these 2 states? California and Florida. All right. They were former Spanish colonies. It's kind of that question just kind of jumps out and grabs you there. Florida was a Spanish colony, and all the way over there, California was a Spanish colony. What was one result of the Treaty of Paris of 1783? Okay. Remember, the Treaty of Paris was of 1783 was after the American Revolution. We won the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. 1783, the war is over. Great Britain recognizes the United States as an independent country. Okay, fine. We're done with the war. You're independent. We've signed the Treaty of Paris, 1783. Which of the following was an argument made against slavery in the 13 colonies? Quakers were a religious group that argued that slavery violated Christian principles. Remember that. It happens in other eras too, that the Quakers were heavily involved in the abolitionists, the abolishing of slavery. They were anti-slavery. Virginia House of Burgesses held its first meeting in 1619, had the power to make laws for the colony, was the first colonial assembly of elected representatives. Which statement explains the significance of this colonial institution? Okay. Yeah, Virginia House of Burgesses was part of Jamestown. Look at that date. That's way long before the first Colonial Continental Congress, right? This is a long time ago. Virginia House of Burgesses was part of Jamestown, which was the very first colony. So think about it. This was the first example. This assembly served as kind of a model for other colonial legislatures, other colonial self-governments. Massachusetts, refuge for English Puritans, as blank was a refuge for English Catholics. Which colony correctly completes this diagram? Well, Maryland. Maryland was a refuge for English Catholics. Remember, we talked about that. Parliament passed the Stamp Act of 1765. That was the cause. What was the immediate effect of Parliament passing the Stamp Act of 1765? Which of the following best completes this diagram? Okay. Colonists organized boycotts of British goods. Remember I said they boycotted these things? Boycott means that we're just refusing to purchase them, and then that ended up forcing the British government to repeal those Stamp Act. They said, fine, if you're going to tax it, we're not going to buy it. We're going to boycott it. They didn't dump tea into the harbor because of a Stamp Act. They dumped tea in the harbor because of a Tea Act. By the way, I just saw that one down there and it caught my eye. Okay, moving on. That all men are equally free and independent and have certain rights of which they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest, remove their posterity, future generations, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Virginia Declaration of Rights, 1776. In this excerpt, the authors of the Virginia Declaration of Rights are describing rights they consider natural and possessed at birth. This is a lot like, and inspired, in fact, the Declaration of Independence. It's saying all men are equally free and independent and have certain rights that you cannot, by any compact, by any resolution or declaration or any right or law or rule, you can't remove these rights from them. And among these are life, liberty, and basically they say the pursuit of happiness and acquiring of land. These rights are natural. All men have them. You possess them at birth. Primary motives for European exploration of the Americas: to increase wealth, blank, to spread Christianity. Which motive best completes the diagram? Okay. To expand empires. Remember I told you that with the British? Want to grow their empire across the globe. Industries of the New England colonies: shipbuilding, fishing, fur trapping and trading, lumber milling. Which physical characteristics made these economic activities possible? Okay. Well, in New England, they had lots of forest. I told you that before. They had big natural harbors. And they had swift rivers, which eventually led to industry because those fast-moving rivers allowed the turning of mills that produced all kinds of energy to have factories to do all kinds of things. So that's what we need to know about the New England colonies. Dense forests, natural harbors, big harbors where you could pull in and make big port cities because you had big natural harbors to pull in big ships. Fundamental orders of Connecticut defined and limited the powers of government, created a General Assembly, granted government the right to levy and collect taxes. Which statement best describes the influence of this document? Okay. It helped establish the tradition of self-government. Again, same theme throughout. This is the early colonial government. They needed their own self-government. All right, guys, just a quick overview. How to prepare for this test. Complete all your buzzwork by April 24th. Well, that's today. At least the day that I'm recording this. Probably not the day you're watching it. Look over this packet, the one that you've downloaded. If you haven't downloaded it, go to my website. Go to STAAR Prep. And then it's at the very bottom of that page. Download it, okay? Download this packet. Watch the videos that I have on my website, including this one. Download and take the practice tests. I don't have those up quite yet. Hopefully I do by the time you're watching this video. But either way, watch all these videos. There's a ton of practice. Memorize that packet. Know that packet inward and outward, backward and forward. Get a good night's sleep before you take the test. Good breakfast the morning of. You guys know that. The test is about 52 questions long. Rather than focusing on what percentage you need in order to pass and make all these grades, I want you to do your best on just every single question. Make sure you read the title, the question, prompt, quote, and image very carefully. Decide what are the things you need to know. Know what you need to know. Then look through all the answer choices and try to eliminate two that you know just that's not right. And then choose the remaining answer that you think is the best one. Whenever you're unsure of an answer, make a note and come back to it later. Sometimes another question later on the test may give you a little bit of insight or memory or trigger something to help you answer that question that you missed earlier. Just make sure when you turn in the test that you've answered all of them, okay? There's some testing tips. I'm not going to go over that right now. This video is long enough as is. Thank you for watching the whole thing. If you did, if you made it this far, appreciate it. It's going to be for your benefit. Continue to study the packet and let me know if you have any other questions.